The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Grand Ballroom, and in that crystalline moment of silence that followed, my daughter-in-law's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Well, at least now we know where Daniel gets his clumsiness from. His mother, the nobody who raised him in that tiny apartment, probably never taught him proper etiquette. The 200 guests at Harrison Tech's annual gala turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as Vivienne's words hung in the perfumed air. I stood there, 62 years old, in my simple black dress from Macy's, feeling the weight of their collective gaze as my son's wife smiled that perfectly practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Eleanor Chan, though at that moment, standing in the ballroom of the Seattle Fairmont Olympic Hotel, I was just Ellie, Daniel's embarrassing mother who had accidentally knocked over a champagne glass while trying to navigate a room full of tech executives and their designer-clad spouses. The invitation to Harrison Tech's 15th anniversary celebration had arrived at my modest home in Bellingham 3 weeks earlier, hand-delivered by Daniel himself during one of his increasingly rare visits. "Mom, you have to come," he'd said, his eyes pleading in that way that reminded me so much of the little boy who used to beg for one more bedtime story. Vivienne insisted. "It's important to her that you're there." I should have recognized the warning signs then, the slight hesitation in his voice, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he mentioned his wife's name. But I'd been so desperate to bridge the growing distance between us, so hungry for any scrap of inclusion in his new life, that I'd ignored my instincts. The drive from Bellingham to Seattle had taken me just under 2 hours that crisp October evening. I'd left my laboratory at the university early, changed in the faculty restroom, and pointed my 15-year-old Honda Civic south on Interstate 5. The car was the same one I'd driven Daniel to college in, back when Harrison Tech was just a startup operating out of a converted warehouse in South Lake Union, and my son was a bright-eyed computer science graduate with dreams bigger than either of us could have imagined. As I navigated Seattle's evening traffic, I'd rehearse conversations in my head, preparing myself for the inevitable questions about my work, my life, the choices I'd made. What I hadn't prepared for was the look of barely concealed horror on Vivienne's face when I'd arrived at the hotel, or the way she'd steered me away from the main entrance where guests were arriving in limousines and town cars, directing me instead to a side entrance where I wouldn't be seen by anyone important. The ballroom itself was a testament to Harrison Tech's meteoric success. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a carefully curated arrangement of orchids that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. The guest list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest power players, venture capitalists from Sand Hill Road, tech journalists from major publications, and early investors who had bet on Harrison Tech when it was nothing more than an idea scribbled on a napkin. I'd spotted Daniel almost immediately, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd. He'd inherited his father's height and my dark hair, though his was styled in the effortlessly casual way that tech executives favored, expensively cut to look deliberately unkempt. He stood near the stage, deep in conversation with men in custom suits, his own attire probably costing more than I spent on clothing in a year. When he'd finally noticed me, his smile had been genuine but brief, quickly replaced by a flicker of something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Vivienne had materialized at his side within seconds, as if she'd been monitoring his reactions from across the room. My daughter-in-law was exactly the kind of woman I'd always known Daniel would eventually marry, tall and willowy, with a kind of effortless elegance that came from a lifetime of cotillions and country clubs. Her family's money was old Seattle timber fortune, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. "Eleanor," she'd said, air kissing near my cheeks without actually making contact. "How lovely that you could make it. Did you have trouble finding parking? The valet service can be so confusing if you're not used to it." The implication was clear. I wasn't used to valet service, to hotels like this, to events where champagne flowed freely and conversations casually referenced summer homes in the San Juan Islands. She'd positioned me at a table near the back of the ballroom, far from the stage where Daniel would be speaking, surrounded by what I quickly realized were the company's junior employees and their guests, people who were present but not important, included but not essential. I'd made polite conversation with a young software engineer named Marcus and his boyfriend, both of whom seemed genuinely kind, if somewhat puzzled by my presence at their table. The incident with the champagne glass had happened during the cocktail hour, when I'd excused myself to use the restroom and found myself disoriented by the hotel's labyrinthine corridors. By the time I'd found my way back to the ballroom, the formal program had begun, and I tried to slip quietly to my table along the perimeter of the room. That's when I'd misjudged the distance to a passing server, my elbow catching the edge of his tray and sending a champagne flute tumbling to the floor. The sound of breaking glass in that acoustically perfect space was deafening. Every head turned, and in that moment, I became the embodiment of everything Vivienne had tried to hide. The reminder that Daniel Chun, co-founder and chief technology officer of Harrison Tech, came from humble beginnings, from a single mother who worked multiple jobs to put him through school, from a background that didn't include country clubs or boarding schools or summers in the Hamptons. Vivienne's comment about clumsiness and tiny apartments had been delivered with a laugh, as if it were all good-natured teasing, but her eyes had been calculating, watching to see how I would react, whether I would shrink away or cause a scene. The guests who'd been close enough to hear her words had responded with uncomfortable titters, unsure whether to join in or pretend they hadn't heard. I'd felt my face flush with humiliation, but I'd maintained my composure, bending to help the server collect the broken glass despite his protests that he would handle it. It was Daniel's reaction or lack thereof that had truly wounded me. My son had stood there, frozen at the front of the room, his face carefully neutral, and said nothing. He'd simply turned back to his conversation as if his mother's public humiliation were beneath his notice. That had been 2 hours ago. Now, as the gala continued around me, I sat at my assigned table, pushing elaborately plated food around my dish while the young couple beside me tried valiantly to include me in their conversation about upcoming product launches and office politics. My phone, an older model that Vivienne had eyed with barely concealed disdain earlier, sat silent in my small clutch purse. No text from Daniel checking if I was all right. No acknowledgement of what had happened. The speeches began as dessert was served. Harrison Tech's CEO, a charismatic man named Gregory Walsh who'd been Daniel's roommate at the University of Washington, took the stage first, outlining the company's trajectory from scrappy startup to industry leader. He spoke eloquently about innovation, about disruption, about the courage it took to challenge established players in the enterprise software space. The audience listened with rapt attention, occasionally bursting into applause at particularly impressive metrics. Then it was Daniel's turn. My son approached the microphone with the easy confidence of someone who'd given hundreds of presentations to rooms full of investors and analysts. He spoke about the technical challenges Harrison Tech had overcome, about the elegant solutions his team had developed, about the future of cloud-based infrastructure management. His presentation was polished, professional, impressive, and completely devoid of any mention of where he'd come from or who had helped him get there. I listened as he thanked Gregory for his partnership, as he acknowledged the early investors who believed in their vision, as he praised his team of engineers for their dedication and brilliance. There was no mention of the scholarship programs that had made his education possible, no recognition of the sacrifices that had enabled his success, no acknowledgement of the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed and focused on his studies. When Daniel finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Vivienne stood at her table near the front, beaming with pride, her diamonds catching the light as she brought her hands together. I remained seated, my own hands folded in my lap, watching my son accept congratulations from the crowd. This was his world now, these were his people, and I was simply an uncomfortable reminder of a past he'd apparently decided to leave behind. The program concluded with a video montage celebrating Harrison Tech's milestones, followed by the announcement of the evening's entertainment, a popular indie band that had the younger employees surging toward the dance floor. I took the opportunity to slip away from my table, making my way toward the hotel's lobby with the intention of collecting my coat and beginning the long drive back to Bellingham. I was standing at the coat check, waiting for the attendant to retrieve my simple wool coat, when I heard Vivienne's voice again. She was around the corner, just out of sight, but her words carried clearly in the marble-floored corridor. "Thank God that's over," she was saying to someone, presumably one of her friends. I was terrified she'd try to talk to the investors. Can you imagine? Daniel's mother explaining to Bernard Whitmore about her work at some community college? It would have been mortifying. The correction formed on my lips automatically. Not a community college. Western Washington University. And not just work. Research. Groundbreaking research in materials science that had resulted in 17 patents and counting. But the words died unspoken because I recognized the futility of defending myself to someone who'd already decided my worth based on the car I drove and the zip code I lived in. I thought you said she wasn't coming, another voice chimed in, younger, probably one of Vivienne's sorority sisters or junior league friends. She insisted, and Daniel felt obligated. Vivienne replied with an audible sigh. But I made sure she was seated appropriately. Can you believe she actually asked if she could bring her colleague from the university? As if this were some casual family dinner where everyone's invited. I had to explain that this was a professional event with very specific optics to maintain. The coat check attendant returned with my garment, and I handed her a $5 bill with trembling fingers.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As I shrugged into my coat, I heard footsteps approaching and turned to find Daniel walking toward me, his expression troubled. Mom, he said quietly. You're leaving already? The dancing just started. I have a long drive ahead of me, I replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral. And I have an early morning tomorrow. Lab work doesn't pause for weekend socializing. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just relief that I was making this easy for him by leaving quietly. Let me at least walk you to your car. That won't be necessary. I found my keys in my purse, gripping them perhaps more tightly than required. Thank you for inviting me, Daniel. It was very enlightening. He flinched at my tone but didn't argue. The lobby was relatively empty at this hour, most guests still enjoying the party in the ballroom. We stood there for a moment, mother and son, separated by far more than the few feet of Italian marble between us. Vivienne didn't mean anything by that comment earlier, he finally said, his voice low. She was just making a joke. You know how these events are, people trying to be entertaining. I see. So humiliating your mother in front of 200 people is entertainment now. I adjusted my purse strap on my shoulder. Tell me, Daniel, when exactly did you become ashamed of where you came from? His face flushed. I'm not ashamed. That's not fair. Isn't it? You didn't correct her when she called me a nobody. You didn't mention me in your speech when you thanked everyone who made your success possible. You seated me in the back of the room like I was someone you hoped no one would notice. Mom, you're being dramatic. This was a professional event, not a family gathering. There's a difference. You're absolutely right, I agreed, buttoning my coat. There is a difference. And now I understand exactly where I stand in your professional life. Or rather, where I don't stand. I turned toward the exit, but his hand on my arm stopped me. His grip was gentle but insistent. Please don't leave like this. Stay, have some champagne, meet some people. These connections could be valuable for your research. Maybe we could find some funding opportunities through Harrison Tech's innovation grants. The offer was so transparently self-serving, so clearly designed to make himself feel better rather than to actually value my work, that I almost laughed. I don't need your charity, Daniel. My research is funded quite adequately through the National Science Foundation and private industry partnerships that value innovation regardless of how prestigious the institution's name might be. That's not what I meant, he protested. But his eyes slid away from mine, unable to hold my gaze. I know exactly what you meant, I said softly. You want me to be grateful for the scraps, to be so dazzled by your success that I don't notice how you've edited me out of your story. But here's what you seem to have forgotten. I didn't raise you to be ashamed of hard work or humble beginnings. I raised you to be better than the people who judge worth by bank accounts and social connections. His jaw tightened. You're being unfair. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to build this company? The sacrifices I've made? Yes, I replied. I do. Because I was there for most of them. I was the one who believed in you when your ideas seemed impossible. I was the one who helped you debug code at 3 in the morning when you had a presentation the next day. I was the one who maxed out credit cards so you could attend that startup conference in Austin where you met Gregory. But apparently, those aren't the kinds of sacrifices worth mentioning in your origin story. Daniel's face had gone pale. Mom, I don't know what you want from me. I don't want anything from you, Daniel. Not anymore. I released a long breath, feeling something shift in my chest, a loosening of expectations I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I wanted you to be proud of where you came from. To understand that success doesn't require erasing your past. But that's not a lesson I can teach you. That's something you'll have to learn on your own. I walked toward the hotel's revolving door, my footsteps echoing on the marble. Behind me, I heard Daniel call my name once, but I didn't turn back. The October air was crisp and cold, clearing my head as I made my way to the parking garage where my Honda sat among the Teslas and BMWs. The drive north was long and dark, Interstate 5 stretching before me like a ribbon of light against the black water of Puget Sound. I drove in silence, no radio, no podcast, just the hum of my engine and the whisper of thoughts I'd been suppressing for months. The distance between Bellingham and Seattle had always been more than geographical. It was the distance between the life I'd built through determination and sacrifice, and the life Daniel had entered through success and marriage into privilege. I thought about the tiny apartment Vivienne had mocked, the one-bedroom place near campus where Daniel had grown up, where I'd converted the dining nook into my study space and he'd done homework at the kitchen table. It had been small, yes, but it had been filled with books and ideas and conversations about everything from quantum mechanics to social justice. Some of my fondest memories were from those years, the two of us against the world, making it work through sheer stubborn determination. My phone buzzed in my purse as I crossed the Skagit County line, but I ignored it. Whatever Daniel had to say, whatever explanation or justification he wanted to offer, could wait. Right now, I needed the quiet darkness of the highway and the approaching lights of home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was nearly midnight. The house was a small craftsman bungalow I'd purchased 5 years ago, after finally achieving some financial stability through my university position and the modest royalties from my patents. It was nothing grand, but it was mine, paid for through my own work, decorated with furniture I'd refinished myself and art from local galleries. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, surrounded by bookshelves and framed photographs, evidence of a life lived with purpose if not luxury. There was Daniel at 8, gap-toothed and proud, holding his first science fair trophy. Daniel at 18 in his graduation gown, my arm around his shoulders. Daniel at 25, shaking hands with Gregory Walsh at Harrison Texan Corporation ceremony, both of them so young and excited about the future they were building. When had things changed? I tried to pinpoint the moment when my son had started viewing his background as something to overcome rather than something to value. Was it when Harrison Tech secured its first major round of funding, and suddenly Daniel was attending networking events with venture capitalists? Was it when he'd started dating Vivienne and been introduced to her world of yacht clubs and charity galas? Or had it been a gradual erosion, so subtle that neither of us noticed until the distance between us had become a chasm? My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 2 text messages. The first was short. Mom, please call me when you get home so I know you're safe. The second, sent an hour later, was longer. I'm sorry about tonight. I know I handled things badly. Can we talk tomorrow? I set the phone down without responding. Tomorrow was Sunday, and I had experiments to run at the lab, data to analyze, a graduate student's thesis to review. My life didn't pause simply because my son had finally noticed his behavior had consequences. Sleep came fitfully that night, my mind replaying the evening's events, examining them from different angles like specimens under a microscope. By the time dawn broke over Bellingham Bay, I'd made a decision. If Daniel wanted to distance himself from his past from me, then I would respect that choice. But I wouldn't sit silently while being dismissed or diminished. I'd built my own life, my own reputation, my own achievements, and those were worth something regardless of whether my son chose to acknowledge them. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, frost coating my garden and turning the world crystalline. I dressed in my usual weekend attire, jeans and a university sweatshirt, made strong coffee and drove to campus. Western Washington University sat on a hilltop overlooking the bay, its red brick buildings and tall evergreens creating a sense of timeless academic pursuit that I'd always found comforting. My laboratory was in the Sciences Complex, a modern building that contrasted sharply with the historic architecture elsewhere on campus. I used my key card to access the building, empty on a Sunday morning except for a few dedicated graduate students and postdocs who treated weekends as just another work day. The familiar smells of the lab greeted me, chemical compounds and equipment, the scent of discovery and investigation. I'd been working in materials science for over 30 years, first as a graduate student myself, then as a postdoc, eventually fighting my way up to a tenured professorship. My specialty was novel polymers for energy applications, work that existed at the intersection of chemistry, physics, and engineering. It was research that had real-world implications, potential applications in everything from solar panels to battery technology to medical devices. The patents that had come from my work weren't just academic exercises. They represented actual innovations that companies were licensing, that were being incorporated into products, that were making incremental improvements to how energy was stored and distributed. Nothing flashy enough to make headlines. Nothing that would impress Vivienne's friends at a cocktail party, but solid, meaningful contributions to human knowledge and capability. I was deep in analyzing spectroscopy data when my phone rang. Not Daniel this time, but a Seattle number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Dr. Chun? The voice was male, professional, slightly hesitant. This is Bernard Whitmore. We met briefly last night at the Harrison Tech Gala, though I don't know if you'd remember. I was speaking with Daniel when you arrived. Bernard Whitmore. The name Vivienne had mentioned, the investor she'd been terrified I might embarrass her in front of. I remembered him vaguely, a silver-haired man in his 60s, distinguished-looking, someone who'd nodded politely in my direction before Vivienne had steered me away. Mr. Whitmore, I said neutrally. What can I do for you? He cleared his throat. I hope you don't mind me tracking down your number. I had to call the university operator and convince them it was important. Dr. Chun, I wonder if you might have time to meet with me this week. There's a business matter I'd like to discuss, and I think you might find it quite interesting. I stared at the spectroscopy readout on my computer screen, Bernard Whitmore's voice still echoing in my ear through the phone. A business matter he wanted to discuss. The phrasing was deliberate, carefully chosen to pique curiosity without revealing too much. In my experience, when wealthy investors use phrases like that, they were either about to make an offer or extract information, and the distinction mattered greatly. What sort of business matter, Mr. Whitmore? I asked, keeping my tone professional but non-committal. I'm a university researcher, not someone typically involved in venture capital discussions. He chuckled softly, a sound that suggested genuine amusement rather than condescension. That's precisely why I'd like to speak with you, Dr. Chun. Your work in advanced polymer applications has caught the attention of several people in my network. But I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, if you're amenable. Perhaps lunch this Tuesday at the Georgian in downtown Seattle? My treat, of course. The Georgian. I knew the restaurant by reputation, an elegant establishment in the Fairmont Olympic Hotel where I'd been so thoroughly humiliated just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I suspected it wasn't coincidental on Whitmore's part either. I appreciate the invitation, I replied carefully, but I'm not sure what I could offer that would be worth your time. My research is fairly specialized and not typically the sort of thing that attracts commercial interest at the investment level. Dr. Chun, Whitmore said, his voice taking on a quality that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. I've been investing in technology companies for 40 years. I've learned to recognize genuine innovation when I see it, regardless of whether it comes from a garage startup or a university laboratory. Your work on thermally conductive polymers has implications that extend far beyond academic journals. Trust me when I say this conversation would be mutually beneficial. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was saying, that this call wasn't as random as he was pretending. I thought about the previous evening, about Vivienne's comment regarding how mortifying it would be if I spoke to Bernard Whitmore, about Daniel's carefully curated presentation that erased any mention of his origins. Curiosity warred with caution, but ultimately curiosity won. Very well, I agreed. Tuesday at noon. I'll be there. Excellent. I look forward to our discussion, Dr. Chun, and please order whatever you like. I have a feeling you'll find this worth your while. After we disconnected, I sat in my laboratory for a long moment, trying to parse what had just happened. Bernard Whitmore was not a small player in the Pacific Northwest investment community. His name appeared on the boards of multiple successful companies, and his early investments had helped launch some of the region's most prominent tech firms. That he would personally call me, track down my number through the university, and invite me to lunch suggested something more than casual interest. I turned back to my computer and pulled up a search for Whitmore Capital Partners. The firm's website was understated but impressive, listing portfolio companies across various sectors from biotechnology to clean energy to advanced manufacturing. Their investment thesis emphasized breakthrough technologies with practical applications, innovations that solved real problems rather than chasing trendy buzzwords. It was exactly the kind of investor that serious researchers dreamed of attracting, assuming you wanted to commercialize your work. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel, calling for what must have been the 5th or 6th time since the previous evening. I stared at his name on the screen, feeling the familiar tug of maternal affection battling against the fresh wound of his betrayal. Finally I answered. Mom, thank God. His relief was palpable even through the phone. I've been worried sick. You didn't respond to any of my messages. I was working, I said simply. Some of us have responsibilities that don't pause for family drama. There was a brief silence, then he sighed. You're angry. I get it. Can we please talk about this? Maybe I could drive up to Bellingham today, take you to lunch, clear the air? I'm afraid I'm busy all day, I replied, which was true enough. I had data to analyze, a thesis to review, and now a meeting to prepare for with an investor who apparently saw value in my work even if my own son didn't. Perhaps another time. Mom, please. I know I messed up last night. Vivienne was out of line, and I should have said something. I should have defended you. Yes, you should have. But you didn't. And that speaks volumes about where your priorities lie, Daniel. That's not fair, he protested. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Vivienne's family invested significant capital in Harrison Tech Series B round. Her father sits on our board. I can't just publicly contradict her at a company event. So your mother's dignity is negotiable when there's money involved. Good to know where I stand in that equation. His frustration crackled through the phone. You're twisting this. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean exactly? I set down my pen and gave him my full attention. Explain to me how allowing your wife to mock my home, my career, and my contribution to your life in front of 200 people was somehow the right choice because her family has money. I was going to talk to her about it privately, he said, his voice defensive. Handle it quietly rather than making a scene at the gala. How very considerate of you. Tell me, Daniel, when were you planning to have this private conversation? Before or after you failed to mention me in your speech thanking everyone who made your success possible? The silence stretched long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was smaller, younger, reminiscent of the boy who used to apologize for tracking mud through the apartment. I don't know what to say, Mom. You're right. I screwed up. Multiple times. I let you down and I'm sorry. The apology was sincere, I could hear that much. But sincerity didn't erase the fact that he'd made a choice, that when it came down to it, he'd chosen his wife's comfort and his investors' opinions over his own mother's dignity. That kind of choice revealed something fundamental about a person's character, and no amount of after-the-fact contrition could completely undo it. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But I need you to understand something, Daniel. I didn't drive to Seattle expecting recognition or thanks. I came because you invited me because I thought it might be a chance to be part of your world, to understand this life you've built. What I learned instead is that I'm an embarrassment to you. A liability to be managed and hidden away. That's not true, he insisted. You're my mother. I love you. Love isn't just a feeling, Daniel. It's a choice you make every day through your actions. And last night, your actions told me exactly how you feel about having a mother who doesn't fit into Vivienne's vision of what a tech executive's family should look like. Before he could respond, I continued. I need to go. I have work to do. When you're ready to have a real conversation about this, one where you actually listen instead of just trying to make yourself feel better, you know where to find me. I ended the call before he could reply, my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down. The conversation had gone exactly as I'd expected, Daniel apologizing but not truly understanding what he was apologizing for, offering excuses disguised as explanations, trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the fundamental problem. The rest of Sunday passed in the focused intensity of laboratory work. I ran polymer samples through thermal analysis, recorded measurements, compared results against theoretical models. The precision of scientific inquiry was soothing. A world where questions had answers, where careful methodology led to reproducible results, where your value was determined by the quality of your work rather than the prestige of your connections. By evening, I'd made significant progress on the data analysis for a paper I was preparing on cross-linked polymer networks. My graduate student, James, had left detailed notes about his own experiments, and I was pleased to see his methodology was sound. He was a first-generation college student from a working-class family in Yakima, brilliant and hard-working, the kind of student who reminded me why I'd chosen academia despite the financial sacrifices it entailed. Monday arrived with its usual flurry of responsibilities. I taught 2 classes, met with students during office hours, attended a tedious faculty meeting about parking policy changes, and squeezed in time to review funding proposals for a National Science Foundation grant panel I served on. It was a full day, the kind that left little room for dwelling on personal disappointments. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my small kitchen, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Catherine Rodriguez, my department chair and a friend of nearly 15 years. She'd been one of the first people to welcome me when I joined the Western Washington faculty, and over the years we developed a relationship that went beyond mere collegiality. Ellie, her warm voice came through the line. I heard through the grapevine that you had an interesting weekend. Want to tell me about it over that bottle of wine you've been promising to share? Word travels fast, I said, pulling out a cutting board to chop vegetables. Who told you? James mentioned that you seemed preoccupied in your meeting this morning. And when I pressed gently, he admitted you'd said something about attending a gala in Seattle that didn't go well. So naturally I need all the details. Despite my lingering melancholy, I found myself smiling. Catherine had a gift for making even painful topics feel manageable through her matter-of-fact warmth. Come over. I'll make pasta and we can indulge in some therapeutic complaining. She arrived 30 minutes later with a good Chianti and a box of expensive dark chocolate, settling into my kitchen like she'd done dozens of times before. As I cooked and she opened the wine, I recounted the events of Saturday evening, from my arrival at the Fairmont Olympic to Vivienne's public humiliation to Daniel's failure to defend me. Catherine listened without interrupting, her dark eyes sympathetic but sharp with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective scientist and administrator. When I finished, she took a long sip of wine before responding. Your son is an idiot, she said bluntly. A successful, wealthy idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. And his wife sounds like exactly the kind of person who gives wealthy people a bad name. I laughed despite myself. Tell me how you really feel, Catherine. She waved her glass expressively. Seriously, Ellie. You raised that boy by yourself, worked multiple jobs to keep him fed and educated, supported his dreams even when they seemed impossible, and this is how he repays you. By letting his social climbing wife treat you like hired help? To be fair, I said, ladling pasta into bowls, Daniel did apologize. Eventually. Apologizing for being caught is not the same as apologizing for the behavior itself. Catherine accepted her bowl and immediately twirled pasta onto her fork. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? He's an adult, he made his choices. I can't force him to value what we had, to remember where he came from. No, but you can stop making it easy for him to take you for granted. Catherine pointed her fork at me for emphasis. You've spent his entire life being understanding, being flexible, putting his needs ahead of your own. Maybe it's time to let him see what happens when you stop accommodating his comfort. I considered this while eating my own pasta. The idea had merit, though it went against every maternal instinct I'd honed over 34 years of parenthood. But Catherine was right about one thing. I had made it easy for Daniel to gradually push me to the periphery of his life, accepting his increasingly rare visits, his distracted phone calls, his vague promises to spend more time together soon. There's something else, I said, and told her about Bernard Whitmore's unexpected call and the upcoming lunch meeting. Catherine's eyes widened. Bernard Whitmore? As in Whitmore Capital Partners? Ellie, do you have any idea how significant that is? I'm a materials scientist, not a business person. I know he's successful, but beyond that, I admitted with a shrug. She set down her fork, her expression intense. Whitmore doesn't take meetings with people unless he's seriously interested in what they're doing. His portfolio companies have a combined market value in the billions. If he's asking to meet with you about your polymer research, it means someone in his network flagged your work as commercially viable at scale. The implications settled over me slowly. My research had always been well regarded within academic circles. I had publications in respected journals, patents that demonstrated practical applications, recognition from my peers. But commercial viability at scale was something different entirely, the translation of laboratory innovations into products that could be manufactured and distributed widely. Who do you think brought me to his attention? I asked. That seems too coincidental, him calling the day after the Harrison Tech Gala. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her analytical mind clearly working through possibilities. Does Harrison Tech use any polymer applications in their products? Could there be a connection through your son's company? I don't think so. Their enterprise software, cloud infrastructure. Nothing that would involve materials science. But I remembered something Daniel had mentioned months ago, before the distance between us had grown quite so vast. He'd talked about Harrison Tech expanding their board, bringing on advisors with expertise in different sectors, as they prepared for an eventual public offering. Unless, Catherine said slowly, Whitmore sits on Harrison Tech's board or advises them in some capacity. That would explain how he became aware of your work, and why the timing coincides with the gala. The possibility opened up new dimensions to consider. If Whitmore was connected to Harrison Tech's governance, then my meeting with him might have implications beyond just my research. It might represent an opportunity to demonstrate to Daniel and Vivienne exactly what they dismissed so casually. Promise me something, Catherine said as we finished dinner and moved to the living room with our wine. Promise me you'll go into that meeting with confidence, that you'll negotiate like the accomplished scientist you are, not like someone who's been made to feel small. Promise, I said, meaning it. Whatever Whitmore wanted to discuss, I would approach it as a professional transaction, an evaluation of mutual interests rather than a favor being bestowed upon me. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of November day that made the Pacific Northwest feel both beautiful and inhospitable. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Whitmore, choosing a tailored navy suit that I typically reserved for conference presentations, paired with low heels and minimal jewelry. Professional, competent, someone to be taken seriously. The drive to Seattle took slightly longer than usual due to morning traffic, giving me time to mentally prepare. I'd brought a leather portfolio containing summaries of my recent research, patent documentation, and publications that demonstrated the breadth and depth of my work. If Whitmore wanted to discuss commercial applications, I would be ready to articulate not just what I discovered but why it mattered. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel looked different in daylight, less intimidating than it had been on Saturday evening. I handed my keys to the valet, noting his professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with Vivienne's insinuation that I wouldn't know how to navigate such services. Inside, the hotel's lobby was bustling with business travelers and tourists, the marble floors gleaming under ornate chandeliers. The Georgian restaurant occupied a corner of the hotel's main floor, its interior decorated in elegant cream and gold tones that spoke of old money and established taste. A hostess greeted me warmly when I gave Whitmore's name, leading me to a corner table where a distinguished man in his mid-60s rose to greet me. Dr. Chun, Bernard Whitmore extended his hand with a genuine smile. Thank you for making the drive down. I hope traffic wasn't too terrible. Not at all, I replied, shaking his hand firmly and taking the seat he held for me. His manners were impeccable, the kind of natural courtesy that came from good breeding rather than performative politeness. We engaged in brief small talk while reviewing menus and placing orders, the standard conversational dance of professional meetings. Whitmore was skilled at it, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest without veering into interrogation. He mentioned growing up in Spokane, attending Stanford for his MBA, the early days of technology investing when Seattle was still emerging from Boeing's shadow. When our appetizers arrived, he shifted smoothly into the purpose of our meeting. Dr. Chun, I'll be direct because I respect your time and intelligence. I've been reviewing your work in thermally conductive polymers, particularly your recent patent on cross-linked networks for heat dissipation in electronic applications. It's extraordinary work, the kind of innovation that could transform several industries if properly developed and commercialized. I set down my fork, giving him my full attention. Thank you. That particular research emerged from trying to solve heat management problems in increasingly compact electronic devices. The applications extend beyond consumer electronics into electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, even aerospace. Exactly. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes sharp with the intensity of someone who'd built his fortune on recognizing potential. I represent a consortium of investors who are specifically looking for breakthrough materials technologies. We're prepared to offer significant funding to license your patents and support further development with an eye toward commercial production. The offer was more direct than I'd anticipated. In academic settings, such conversations typically involved months of preliminary discussions, memorandums of understanding, careful negotiations through university technology transfer offices. Whitmore was proposing to bypass much of that typical process. Mr. Whitmore, I said carefully, I appreciate the interest, but you should know that any commercialization of university research would need to go through Western Washington's Technology Transfer Office. I can't simply license patents that partially belong to the institution. He smiled, clearly expecting this response. Of course. I've already had preliminary conversations with your technology transfer director, Dr. Morrison. She's receptive to discussions, provided you're interested in pursuing commercialization. This lunch is really about gauging your interest and vision for how this technology might be developed. You've done your homework, I observed, both impressed and slightly wary. This level of preparation suggested Whitmore had been considering this move for some time, which raised questions about his timeline and motivations. I always do, he replied. When I invest, I'm not just investing in technology. I'm investing in people, in their vision and capability to see innovations through to real-world applications. Your track record suggests you're someone who understands both the science and its practical implications. We spent the next hour in deep discussion about my research. Whitmore asked insightful questions that revealed he'd either done extensive reading or consulted with technical experts. He wanted to understand not just what my polymers could do, but why they were superior to existing solutions, what manufacturing challenges would need to be overcome, what markets represented the most promising initial applications. I found myself engaged in the conversation in a way I rarely experienced outside of academic conferences. Whitmore didn't just want to exploit my innovations. He wanted to understand them, to explore their potential thoughtfully and strategically. It was refreshing after Saturday evening's experience, where my life's work had been dismissed as activities at some community college. As our main courses arrived, Whitmore shifted topics slightly. Dr. Chun, I hope you don't mind me mentioning that I was present at the Harrison Tech Gala on Saturday. I had the unfortunate experience of witnessing how you were treated by certain individuals. I felt my face warm with embarrassment, but I maintained my composure. It was an enlightening evening in several respects. I'm sure it was. Whitmore cut his salmon with precise movements. For what it's worth, I found the entire incident distasteful. I've known Daniel for several years now through my advisory role with Harrison Tech, and I've always been curious about his background. He's brilliant technically, but there's always been something incomplete about his origin story as he tells it. The implication hung between us, and I realized this lunch was about more than just my research. Whitmore had seen an opportunity to learn something about one of his investment portfolio companies, while simultaneously evaluating a potentially valuable technology licensing deal. Daniel prefers to focus on his achievements rather than his origins, I said diplomatically. That's his choice to make. Of course. Though I've always found that the most successful entrepreneurs are those who remain grounded in where they came from, who use their early struggles as motivation rather than embarrassment. Whitmore met my eyes directly. When your daughter-in-law made those comments about tiny apartments and nobodies, I did some research. I discovered that the nobody she was mocking holds 17 patents, has published over 60 peer-reviewed papers, and is widely respected in materials science circles. I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply inclined my head in acknowledgement. I also discovered, Whitmore continued, that the woman she dismissed so casually put herself through graduate school while raising a child alone, worked 3 jobs to ensure that child had opportunities, and never once compromised her own intellectual pursuits despite significant obstacles. That's not a nobody, Dr. Chun. That's exactly the kind of person I want to work with. The compliment was unexpected and surprisingly affecting. I'd spent so many years simply doing what needed to be done, surviving and pushing forward, that I'd rarely stopped to consider my own accomplishments as anything remarkable. My research is important to me, I said quietly. It always has been. Even when circumstances made it difficult to pursue, I couldn't imagine not trying to understand how materials behave, how we might engineer solutions to problems that seem intractable. That passion is what makes great innovation possible, Whitmore replied. Technical skill is necessary but not sufficient. What separates truly transformative work from merely competent work is the drive to keep pushing when others would have quit. We finished our meal discussing potential next steps. Whitmore outlined a generous licensing proposal that would provide immediate funding for expanded research, while maintaining my academic freedom and recognition. He suggested forming a spin-off company to develop commercial applications, with me retaining significant equity and control over the technical direction. It was exactly the kind of offer that researchers dreamed of receiving, the opportunity to see laboratory innovations translated into real-world impact without sacrificing the intellectual integrity of the work. But I wasn't naive. Whitmore's timing wasn't coincidental, and his interest in my research was entangled with his connection to Harrison Tech. Mr. Whitmore, I said as our coffee arrived, I need to ask you directly, how does this proposed collaboration relate to your role with Harrison Tech? I need to understand any potential conflicts of interest or complications that might arise from working with you. He nodded approvingly, as if I'd passed some kind of test. Fair question. I serve on Harrison Tech's advisory board and hold a modest equity position. However, your polymer research has no direct relationship to their software business. The conflict of interest, if any, would be personal rather than commercial. Personal in what sense? He stirred sugar into his coffee slowly before responding. I'm offering you this opportunity based purely on the merit of your work, Dr. Chun. But I'd be lying if I said Saturday evening's events didn't influence my decision to accelerate these discussions. I was already aware of your research through my network, but seeing how you were treated, and by whom, clarified certain things for me about character and values. So this is partly about making a point, I said. About demonstrating to my son and his wife that they misjudged me. Whitmore's smile was slight but knowing. I prefer to think of it as ensuring that excellence is properly recognized and rewarded. If that also serves to educate certain individuals about respect and humility, well, that's simply a beneficial side effect. I considered this carefully. There was a certain appeal to the idea of proving Vivienne wrong, of demonstrating that the nobody she'd mocked was actually someone with considerable professional value. But accepting Whitmore's offer for those reasons felt petty, beneath the standards I'd maintained throughout my career. I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Whitmore, and I'm genuinely interested in exploring commercialization of my research. But I need to be clear that any decision I make will be based on the merits of the opportunity, not on personal considerations or family dynamics. Of course, he agreed immediately. I would expect nothing less from you. Take time to review the proposal I'll have my team send over. Consult with your technology transfer office, seek independent legal advice. I'm confident that when you evaluate this strictly on its merits, you'll find it compelling. We concluded the lunch with handshakes and promises to be in touch soon. As I walked back through the hotel lobby toward the valet stand, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Excitement about the potential for my research, certainly, but also a kind of vindication that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Bernard Whitmore, the very investor Vivienne had been terrified I might embarrass her in front of, had not only engaged with me as an equal but offered me an opportunity that could significantly advance my work. The drive back to Bellingham gave me time to process everything. Catherine would be excited when I told her about the offer, I knew. She'd been encouraging me for years to pursue commercialization more aggressively, arguing that my research deserved wider impact than academic publications alone could provide. But I also knew I needed to tell Daniel about these developments, despite our strained relationship. Whatever had happened between us, he deserved to know that his mother was potentially entering into a business relationship with one of his company's advisors. The conversation would be awkward, but it was necessary. That evening I called him. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice cautious as if he'd been waiting for my call but wasn't sure what to expect. Mom, hi. How are you? I'm well, I replied. Listen, Daniel, I need to tell you something. I had lunch with Bernard Whitmore today. There was a pause, then confusion colored his tone. Whitmore? From our advisory board? Why were you meeting with him? He called me Sunday morning and asked to discuss my research. Apparently, he's interested in licensing some of my polymer patents and potentially funding commercialization work. The silence stretched longer this time. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried a note of disbelief. Whitmore wants to invest in your research. Are you sure that's what he said? Yes, Daniel. I'm quite capable of understanding a business proposal when it's explained to me. No, that's not what I meant. He stumbled over his words, clearly trying to recalibrate. I'm just surprised. I didn't know Whitmore was interested in materials science. His portfolio is mostly software and medical devices. Innovation transcends specific sectors, I said, hearing an edge creep into my voice. He recognizes that breakthrough materials technology has applications across multiple industries. But I wanted to inform you about this because of his connection to Harrison Tech. I don't want there to be any awkwardness or conflict of interest issues. Right, yeah, of course. Daniel still sounded stunned. So this is serious? Like, he's actually going to make you an offer? He already made an offer. I'm reviewing it with the university's technology transfer office, and will likely retain an attorney to ensure my interests are properly protected. There was something in Daniel's tone that I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been chagrin or embarrassment. Mom, that's incredible. Really, I'm happy for you. Thank you, I said, though his response felt hollow somehow, more automatic than genuine. Does Vivienne know? He asked suddenly. About your meeting with Whitmore? I have no idea how she would know unless you've told her. The meeting just happened today. No, I haven't said anything. I just thought maybe Whitmore mentioned it to someone and word got around. I found his concern about Vivienne's knowledge oddly telling. He was worried about how his wife would react to learning that the mother-in-law she'd publicly dismissed was being courted by one of their advisors. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel, I said gently, this really has nothing to do with Vivienne or Harrison Tech. It's simply a professional opportunity that I'm evaluating based on its own merits. Right, of course. He cleared his throat. I really am happy for you, Mom. You deserve recognition for your work. We spoke for a few more minutes, but the conversation remained stilted, both of us dancing around the real issues that lay between us. When we finally said goodbye, I felt more distant from my son than I had before we spoke, as if the news of Whitmore's interest had somehow widened rather than bridged the gap between us. The rest of the week passed in a flurry of activity. Dr. Morrison from the Technology Transfer Office reviewed Whitmore's preliminary proposal and pronounced it extremely favorable, noting that the proposed terms were significantly better than typical licensing agreements the university negotiated. She encouraged me to retain an intellectual property attorney to review the details, and recommended someone from a Seattle firm that specialized in university technology commercialization. Catherine, predictably, was ecstatic when I shared the news over coffee in her office. Ellie, this is enormous. Do you realize what this could mean? Not just for you personally, but for our entire department for the university. If this leads to a successful commercial venture, the recognition and funding implications could be transformative. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself, I cautioned, though I couldn't completely suppress my own excitement. Still early days. There are approvals needed, negotiations to complete, technical hurdles to overcome. But the momentum is there, Catherine insisted. And honestly, after what happened at that gala, I'm pleased to see you getting the recognition you deserve from someone who actually matters in the business world. 3 weeks later, I found myself back in Seattle, this time for a very different kind of gathering. Whitmore had invited me to a small dinner at his Mercer Island home to meet the other investors in the consortium he was assembling. It was an opportunity to present my research directly to the people whose capital would fund its commercialization, and I'd prepared extensively. What I hadn't prepared for was discovering that Daniel and Vivienne had also been invited. I arrived at Whitmore's waterfront estate just before sunset, the November sky painted in shades of copper and violet over Lake Washington. A valet took my car, and a staff member escorted me into a spacious living room where about 15 people mingled with cocktails, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the spectacular view. I spotted Daniel almost immediately, standing near the fireplace in conversation with 2 older men I didn't recognize. His posture stiffened when he saw me, surprise flickering across his features before he managed a careful smile. Vivienne stood slightly apart, speaking with a cluster of women in expensive cocktail attire, her back to the door. Dr. Chan, Whitmore appeared at my elbow with perfect timing, his hand light on my arm as he guided me into the room. I'm so pleased you could make it. Let me introduce you to some people who are very eager to hear about your work. For the next hour, I circulated through the gathering discussing polymer applications with venture capitalists, explaining thermal conductivity to manufacturing executives, answering technical questions from engineers who worked for various portfolio companies. It was exhilarating to engage with people who grasped not just the scientific elegance of the research, but its commercial potential. Daniel approached me as I was explaining cross-linking mechanisms to a woman from a battery technology firm. "Mom," he said quietly during a lull in conversation, "can we talk for a moment?" I excused myself from the group and followed him to a quieter corner of the room. His expression was difficult to read, something between pride and discomfort. "You didn't tell me you'd be here tonight," he began. "I didn't know you would be either," I replied. "Whitmore invited me to present my research to potential investors. I assume you're here because of Harrison Tech's relationship with him?" "Yes, he and Vivienne's father are discussing some board matters." He glanced toward his wife, who still hadn't acknowledged my presence. "Mom, I need to apologize properly for what happened at the gala. Not just with words but with actions. I've been thinking about what you said about how my choices reflected my priorities." I waited, giving him space to continue. "You were right. I let Vivienne's insecurity about her own worth dictate how I treated you. I was so focused on fitting into this world, on being accepted by people with money and connections, that I forgot the most important connection I have is with you." His eyes were damp, and I felt my own throat tighten. "That means a great deal to me, Daniel. But words are easy. The real question is whether you're willing to stand by them when it's uncomfortable." "I am," he said firmly. "Starting now." He took my hand and led me directly to where Vivienne stood with her friends. "Vivienne," he said, his voice carrying enough authority that her group fell silent, "I need you to apologize to my mother for your comments at the gala." Vivienne's face went pale, then flushed red. Her eyes darted around the group, clearly mortified to be called out publicly. "Daniel, this isn't the time." "Actually, it is," he insisted. "You humiliated her in front of 200 people. The least you can do is apologize in front of 15. The tension in that corner of the room was palpable. Vivienne's friend stepped back slightly, creating space around the confrontation. I saw Whitmore watching from across the room, his expression neutral but his attention focused entirely on our interaction. "Eleanor," Vivienne finally said, her voice tight, "I apologize if my comments at the gala were hurtful. That wasn't my intention." "It wasn't an if situation," Daniel corrected. "Your comments were deliberately hurtful and disrespectful. Try again." Vivienne's jaw clenched, but she met my eyes. "I apologize for what I said. It was inappropriate and unkind. It wasn't much, but it was something." I nodded acceptance, not because the apology was adequate but because Daniel's willingness to demand it meant more than Vivienne's reluctant words. Before anyone could speak further, Whitmore called the group to attention. "If everyone could take their seats," he announced, gesturing toward a dining room visible through an archway. "Dinner is served, and Dr. Chan has graciously agreed to share some insights about her remarkable research." The dinner was extraordinary, not just for the food but for the conversation. Whitmore had seated me at the head of the table opposite him, a position of honor that wasn't lost on anyone present. Between courses, I presented a brief overview of my polymer research, fielding questions that demonstrated genuine interest and understanding. What struck me most was how the dynamic had shifted. These powerful investors, these people who shaped industries and launched companies, were listening to me with respect and attention. My work mattered to them not because of who I was connected to, but because of what I had accomplished through decades of dedicated research. Across the table, I caught Daniel watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Pride certainly, but also something that might have been wonder, as if he were seeing his mother clearly for the first time in years. Vivienne sat beside him, subdued and silent, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. After dinner, as guests mingled over coffee and dessert, Whitmore drew me aside. "Dr. Chan, I have some news I wanted to share with you personally before it becomes public. The consortium has finalized our investment terms, and pending your approval and the university's agreement, we're prepared to fund your research with an initial commitment of $12 million. The number was staggering, far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. $12 million would revolutionize not just my own work, but the entire materials science program at Western Washington. It would fund graduate students, purchase equipment, support collaborative research with other institutions." "That's incredibly generous," I managed to say. I'm honored by your confidence in this work. It's not generosity, Whitmore replied. It's good business. Your innovations have the potential to disrupt multiple industries. We're investing because we believe in the technology and in your ability to bring it to market. He paused, then added with a slight smile, and I confess there's some satisfaction in demonstrating that the woman your daughter-in-law called a nobody at a company party is actually someone who commands significant attention in the investment community. I appreciated his honesty about his motivations, even as I understood that the business case stood independent of any personal considerations. Mr. Whitmore, I said, meeting his eyes directly, I want to be clear about something. I'm grateful for this opportunity, truly. But my decision to move forward isn't about proving anyone wrong, or making a point about family dynamics. It's about advancing research that I believe can make a meaningful difference. Which is exactly why I wanted to work with you, he replied. Character matters in long-term partnerships, Dr. Chan. Your integrity is as valuable to me as your technical expertise. The evening concluded with handshakes and promises to finalize agreements in the coming weeks. As guests began departing, Daniel found me near the entrance. Can I drive you back to Bellingham? He asked. I know you have your own car, but I'd really like the time to talk. Vivienne can drive my car home. I considered refusing, but something in his expression made me agree. We retrieved my coat, and Daniel spoke briefly with Vivienne, who nodded stiffly, still clearly unsettled by the evening's events. The drive north was quiet at first, both of us adjusting to being alone together after weeks of tension. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I had no idea, Mom. About your research, about its significance. I mean, I knew you were a professor, that you published papers and had patents, but I didn't understand what that actually meant in practical terms. You never asked, I said simply. And I never forced the conversation because I didn't want you to feel obligated to be interested in polymer chemistry just because it's what I do. But that's the thing, he replied, his hands tight on the steering wheel. I should have been interested because it matters to you. The way you listened to my ideas when I was developing Harrison Tech, the way you asked questions and engaged even when you didn't fully understand the technical details. You showed me respect for my work even when I was just starting out, and I never returned that courtesy. We drove in silence for a while, the lights of small towns flickering past as we headed north. I thought about all the years of Daniel's childhood, the sacrifices I'd made that I'd never discussed with him, the opportunities I'd declined to ensure his needs were met. I'd never wanted him to feel guilty about what I'd given up, never wanted him to carry that burden. But perhaps in protecting him from that knowledge, I'd inadvertently taught him that my work, my dreams, my accomplishments didn't matter as much as his. That my role was to facilitate his success rather than pursue my own. Daniel, I said finally, I don't need you to be interested in polymer chemistry. But I do need you to respect that my work has value. That the choices I've made in my career were meaningful even if they didn't lead to the kind of wealth and status you've achieved. I know that now, he said quietly. Watching you tonight, seeing how those investors responded to you, how Whitmore clearly values your expertise. I realize that I've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. You've made real contributions to human knowledge, Mom. That's worth more than any company valuation or investment round. We talked for the rest of the drive, the kind of honest, searching conversation we hadn't had in years. Daniel told me about the pressures of running a rapidly growing company, the constant need to project confidence and success, the way Vivienne's family expectations had shaped his behavior in ways he was only now recognizing. I shared my own experiences of navigating academia as a single mother, the subtle and not so subtle discrimination I'd faced, the satisfaction of breakthrough research that made all the struggles worthwhile. By the time we pulled into my driveway, something had shifted between us. Not a complete healing that would take time, but the beginning of understanding, a recognition that the distance between us had been built on assumptions and failures to communicate rather than fundamental incompatibility. Mom, Daniel said as I prepared to get out of the car, can I take you to breakfast tomorrow before I drive back to Seattle? Just the two of us, no Vivienne, no business discussions. I want to hear about your life, about what you're working on, about everything I've missed. I'd like that, I replied, meaning it completely. The next morning found us at a diner near the waterfront, the kind of unpretentious place with excellent coffee and portions sized for loggers and fishermen. Daniel looked slightly out of place in his expensive casual wear, but he didn't seem to notice or care. We talked for 3 hours, losing track of time as we rebuilt the connection that had frayed over years of neglect. When he finally left for Seattle, we embraced in the parking lot, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, it felt like hugging my son rather than a distant, successful stranger who happened to share my DNA. The weeks that followed brought rapid developments. The licensing agreement was finalized, the consortium's investment formalized, and preliminary plans laid for a spin-off company that would develop commercial applications of my polymer research. Western Washington University was thrilled with the arrangement, recognizing the prestige and funding implications for the institution. Catherine threw a small celebration in the faculty lounge, inviting colleagues from across the sciences to toast the department's success. Standing there with a plastic cup of champagne, surrounded by people who'd supported my work for years, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with validation of choices I'd made decades earlier. Daniel called regularly now, checking in on both my personal life and the progress of the commercialization efforts. He'd started attending therapy, he told me, working through issues around class anxiety and the ways his rapid ascent had distorted his values. Vivienne was in counseling too, confronting her own insecurities about worth and status. 6 months after that fateful gala, I received an invitation to speak at Harrison Tech's company-wide meeting. Daniel had asked me to present about innovation and persistence, about the long path from laboratory discovery to commercial application. This time, I would be introduced not as Daniel's mother but as Dr. Eleanor Chan, materials scientist and entrepreneur. As I stood before Harrison Tech's assembled employees, including the same people who'd witnessed my humiliation at the gala, I spoke about my research journey with pride and confidence. I talked about the value of foundational science, about patient dedication to difficult problems, about the importance of recognizing that innovation comes from unexpected places. And when I finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. Daniel stood in the front row, beaming with unmistakable pride. Even Vivienne managed a respectful nod, her earlier disdain replaced by something that might eventually evolve into genuine respect. The woman who'd been called a nobody at a company party had shown them all exactly who signed the paychecks, not through petty revenge, but through the quiet power of work that mattered, relationships that endured, and integrity that couldn't be purchased at any price. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.